Yeah, so I think we'll sort of move into the second slide there. The talk today, as mentioned, we're going to be going through a variety of aspects in combating fraud and financial abuse of older adults. And I'm coming to you today as a part of the Legal Information Society of Nova Scotia. So it's a charitable nonprofit organization, and we've been providing Nova Scotians with information and resources about the law for over 40 years. And I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Halifax, Nova Scotia, and we are located on the traditional and unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq people as well. And next slide. In this talk, I'll introduce financial fraud and abuse in older adults and explore issues that really heighten the risk of an older adult becoming a victim. I'll also be highlighting aspects of criminal and civil liability that impact victims. And I'll finish with some promising practices, as was mentioned, from a sort of regional Nova Scotian perspective. So if there are any practices in your community or region that you're willing to share, it'd be great if you added those to the chat to share at the end of the session. We're always interested to hear what is working around the country, what challenges people are facing, and it's so helpful to learn from all of your experiences. So feel free to enter those in, and hopefully we'll get to some of those at the end of the session. Okay. To start, I'd like to preface my talk by saying I take a really human rights-based approach to issues of financial fraud and abuse. So in my research, I emphasize really the cultural conditioning that has integrated ageism and discrimination of persons with disabilities into financial decision-making. So when I'm analyzing the connections here between victims and perpetrators, it's really understanding that financial abuse is within this larger context. And with that sort of acknowledgement as well, moving into some numbers, it's a good way to kind of position us at the start here. So the next slide. Statistically, the percentage of older adults in the wider population is growing. So that's something where a lot of us are pretty familiar with. Nova Scotia in particular has a higher population of 65 plus than that of the rest of the Canada as a whole. So you see in those two percentages, when you're talking about Nova Scotia, it's closer to 23% versus closer to 19% across the rest of Canada. And one of the aspects in Nova Scotia that's a little different is that the seniors are really spread fairly equally across the rural and urban areas. And so the population what that we're considering here is in particular really a part of just a shift, right? A shift in the issues and the amounts of issues that are being seen in older adult populations that maybe hadn't been previously. And so where it's really acknowledged to say reporting rates are very low, upwards of maybe 5 to 10% is what the authorities kind of point to as actually being reported when a financial fraud or abuse occurs. Those low rates are complicated, and we'll get into this a bit later, more in depth, to that high percentage. You see there that 74% of reported frauds are actually perpetrated by family members. So that higher rate, that disproportionate, some people's minds rate, is actually quite connected to the group that we're focused on today. So it's a part of the equation we'll get into a bit more throughout the talk. So next slide. You know, what are the definitions of financial abuse and fraud, right? What's the difference? So financial abuse is the unethical or illegal misuse of the money, property, or other assets of an older adult. So often the perpetrator is a family member, a friend, or a paid caregiver. Whereas financial fraud involves the use of deception to illegally obtain money, property, or personal information, and often the perpetrator is unknown to the victim, and scams can be specifically targeted to the older adult demographic. So we see that there's no one single definition, but that there's a divide between the two, this abuse and fraud, based on lines of that victim-perpetrator relationship, right? The closer the connection, the more likely it'll be considered more of an abuse versus a fraud. And those overlapping roles will pop up again and again as we kind of work through this content. And I also would like to mention, in regards to definitions, recognize at this stage the final report prepared for the Department of Justice Canada by Université de Sherbrooke, that in-depth assessment on the difficulties in gathering data about abuse of older persons. And so many of the terms and definitions related to abuse or mis or maltreatment, amongst others, they're definitely not settled in any way in my talk. But my aim is to really shine a spotlight on the challenges we're facing in this area and highlight ways we can address them in our communities to really understand the differences and similarities. Next slide. Some common examples of financial abuse: forging signatures, misusing or stealing debit or credit cards, taking money without permission, forcing or deceiving the older adult into signing a legal document like a contract or a will, and also improper use of a guardianship or representation order, and in some cases of a power of attorney. This last example of a power of attorney is one of the highest reported forms of financial abuse because the attorney is often an adult child of the maker of the POA, so the power of attorney. They're subject to just a wide variety of fiduciary responsibilities that come alongside the duties in that written power of attorney document, but they also have more opportunity to misuse the document because powers of attorney have such strong acting authority. You'll see in this image by Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario, they present 4 forms of intimate partner violence present in older adults. And the financial abuse described: controlling access, asserting undue influence over the other partner, is something we really see, and is something that, for example, is a common misapplication of the authority that is granted under a power of attorney. So as an example, in R.V. Earhart, a common law spouse used multiple emotional and psychological controlling and coercive means, including having a power of attorney signed by the victim to drain that common law partner's accounts prior to her passing. So it's really, you can kind of see just at this initial stage when we're talking about financial abuse, it really goes into several other aspects of the individual's life that involve this sort of overlapping interrelationship. In the cases of abuse by a family member, a care provider, a friend, that financial abuse goes hand in hand with the psychological or emotional abuse. So this is really a common theme because, the interconnectedness of that relationship brings a level of intimacy or familiarity with that older adult's living situation, right? So threats to withhold affection or social contact if the senior doesn't hand over money results in, yelling or bullying or verbal abuse. And that sort of reliance and that role of caregiver in a lot of circumstances can really heighten that risk. The next. Regional differences also play a part in understanding how financial abuse is defined throughout provinces and territories. So in Nova Scotia, financial abuse is required to be reported if it takes place against an older adult in a residential or care facility. So if the senior is residing in a long-term care facility, the Protection for Persons in Care Act requires some mandatory reporting to a Department of Health and Wellness, whether the senior has a decision-making capacity or not, if they're being financially abused under regulations set out associated with that act. Otherwise, there's only a mandatory duty to report non-financial forms of abuse where the older adult is vulnerable in broader community living examples. So maybe the person has a mental or a physical disability. the Adult Protection Act, a separate piece of legislation, has some mandatory requirements for reporting. But across Canada, only 6 of the 13 jurisdictions actually require some form of mandatory reporting to any agency or department where that abuse is occurring. So Francis Carr's article referenced at the end of my presentation, it's got a great table outlining different reporting requirements in the various Canadian jurisdictions. And it also kind of gives us an idea of why there is such a difference once you start to look into it from province to territory. Financial frauds are growing across Canada, and we see it now with more media coverage than ever. Investment and service frauds are the most reported. In 2025, there was over $700 million lost to reported frauds. And again, this sort of upwards of no more than 10% of frauds actually being reported holds true across financial abuse and financial fraud. So the tables there provided by the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre shows the various types of frauds occurring. And one particular fraud that's targeting older adults that we've seen in the last couple of years are grandparent scams. Grandparent scams have become popular really due to a whole bunch of reasons, but particularly the presence of information on social media sites that's shared by family members, and the artificial intelligence voice generator tools that are out there and so easy for people to get access to. In the Maritimes, we were seeing quite a rise in seniors being called by someone posing as a relative. Usually the caller would pretend to be the grandchild of the senior, claim to be in some sort of legal trouble, and then I would ask the grandparent to supply bail money or funds of some sort so they could be released or they could, get out of this issue that they were in. In Nova Scotia, it's really difficult to check whether someone's actually been arrested when you get a call like that. So if the person posing as a friend or a bail bondsman arrives at the grandparent's front door to collect the money, the senior's just handing it over, trying to help that family member. That type of fraud is really specific, but it's also kind of a canary in a coal mine for initiatives like family safe words, family safe codes, right? So these scams have been drivers for really the campaign promoting the use of, say, a family safe word to be able to check if the person who's calling is in fact that family member, which is a great strategy to help avoid that type of scam, which is kind of mixing some personal information that's available to that fraudster, but also playing up on that personal relationship that the person has with a person who is not, in fact, the one they think they're helping. In identifying frauds that are more likely to target seniors, the RCMP, Nova Scotia Securities Commission, they've highlighted internet and social networking scams, direct call scams, and door-to-door scams. So we see particularly the service scams in the direct call and door-to-door scams targeting older adults. Sometimes there's a personal connection. Again, they'll kind of use some information of neighboring people in the community to then build some kind of relationship to then convince the person to enter into this fraud. But most often they're perpetrated by unknown individuals. So that's that little bit of a difference between that financial situation being labeled as abuse versus fraud. But the complicating part that we see is where they mix even more closely. So if we look at romance or sort of friend scams, we start to see the crossovers of that financial abuse and financial fraud. So here's an example that's just happened locally in March. The individual provided upwards of $300,000 to a Facebook connection that claimed to be going through hard times. They were able to gain the trust and affection of the victim in order to get access to these funds. The funds were sent. Personal, private information was shared over months of communications. And really a relationship develops, but we know it's pretty much a singular purpose of getting as much money from the victim as possible. But in doing so, and I think this is the core part as we're going through the talk today, there's this feeling by the victim that they're actually sharing feelings and have responsibilities towards this perpetrator. right? So the key for us in helping these victims is by understanding that those same loyalties a person feels for a family member, they're often present in the mind of the victim for the perpetrator. And so the support services we offer look really similar, if not identical, whether we're addressing financial abuse or financial fraud. And that kind of brings in to view power dependency relationships and vulnerabilities in these financial fraud and abuse cases for older adults. As I was sort of foreshadowing there, the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator, it may be one of family, friend, or caregiver, but in some cases, it's an individual they haven't met in person, or they may have met but really briefly and feel a strong emotional connection to. So we see power dependency relationships really complicating the reporting and accountability because of those dynamics between the victim and the perpetrator. And so the victim is dependent on the perpetrator for that intimacy that's only shared with that person, whether or not they've had them in their lives for years or months. The fraud sort of capitalizes on that relationship to the detriment of the older adult, despite, being developed really for that financial abuse / fraud purpose. I also mentioned briefly that in that mandatory or not mandatory in financial abuse examples, reporting requirements. The Adult Protection Act I referenced there basically deals with adults that are facing those physical, emotional, and sexual abuse scenarios, but they don't have decision-making ability to handle those issues on their own. And because the Adult Protection Act doesn't address financial abuse, in those complaints involving financial abuse by family members, about 80% of those cases involve actions that are taken under an enduring power of attorney. So the older adult has signed off on a document naming the agent to act for them, but they are now dependent on this attorney under the authority structured within the document. So the structure, whether it is in legislation or in the court system or in the reporting system, is really also subject to the document that the person entered into and all those issues surrounding that. And that brings us to the next slide on these vulnerabilities, whether they're perceived or real vulnerabilities about older adults. In either case, they play like a really large role in how financial fraud and abuse is addressed in the older adult population. The identification here of 4 factors making older adults vulnerable to financial fraud and abuse include physiological. So there may be a cognitive decline, perhaps where there's been a medical diagnosis received by the older adult. There's the psychological. There's some kind of elevated fear maybe of an unknown, particularly if there's a technology component like in cyber crimes. Familial, for example, a family or friend relationship from an insider type fraud. And then sociocultural, so isolation playing a role in the targeting of that senior. Taking a look at physiological, so cognitive decline, it can lead older adults to seek emotional substitutes for, say, the loss of a partner or a lifelong friendship, and the associated reduced social life. So those feelings of isolation, it'll make it more likely that they'll fall a victim to fraud or financial abuse. Psychological, ageism perpetuates stereotypes and portrays older adults as vulnerable and gullible a lot of the time. And if there's a real experience of psychological distress, that will increase the likelihood of exposure to harm of the older adult. But ageism also emboldens a perpetrator because there's this belief that the older adult will be more easily manipulated, whether the perpetrator is correct or not for that specific adult. But in some ways, it'll kind of encourage them to put more into it, to go harder, to zero in on that older adult more than they would someone who was not older. Familial, the third factor, seniors living independently may rely on one or more caregivers to provide support. Usually these people are family members. But we also know that healthcare professionals are also usually the first to uncover that an older adult is being financially abused. There's not a lot of training. There's little support to healthcare professionals to prevent financial abuse if it's not coupled with those other types of abuses in a really more obvious way. So that older adult is likely suffering more than just financial abuse. And that is where we kind of see the tie-in with mandatory reporting. And it's so valuable where the healthcare provider may be the first to spot that familial connection, that sort of insider fraud type situation, and then also can pair it with other indicators of abuse that they have been trained to report. So that's just another sort of aspect there that kind of going beyond that just straightforward kinship relationship to say that there are there's an additional opportunity to address that through that healthcare interaction. And then the fourth is sociocultural. So, loneliness is significantly predicted. Older adults' vulnerability to fraud and susceptibility to increasing the risk of falling victim to fraud by when. We see in practice, isolation is a serious complicating factor because the isolated older adult will lack that social network. They don't have maybe the opportunity to build that trusted support group, and often they'll physically isolate themselves. So they'll lose or they'll have less access to medical supports that then really exacerbate a cognitive decline. So when they do encounter a problem with financial abuse, they just don't have a trust circle to rely upon. Or if they get that fraudulent interaction, they don't have someone to ask those questions of or seek support, and it just builds on itself. This figure by Lazarus et al. Illustrates factors increasing the opportunities used by perpetrators to defraud senior populations, and that's modified from Burton. What I want to highlight here is in the bottom section of the box where there's the risk of repeat victimization. And we see that a lot amongst older adult populations. So victims often won't report financial abuse and fraud because of societal attitudes. So they don't want to be viewed as victims. They want to keep their problems private. They fear the loss of independence if they share that they've been taken advantage of. And if they can control the impact of that financial loss, they'd rather take on that burden than risk, the interference of family or other intervening workers. So because of the low success in financial recovery, it often feels to victims like the police and agencies have a low priority for financial crimes, and people are redirected to other agencies, right, to report the losses when the abuse is financial. And it can feel like there's no one there to help the victims because it's likely they're not going to receive any meaningful restitution. It's likely, civil recovery is not going to be successful. It's very very low success rates, even when the perpetrator has assets to kind of claim from, to garnish or enforce an order against. So kind of in that environment, once the victim's subject to a fraud like, say, a cybercrime or any kind of financial abuse, particularly though related to these online frauds, the perpetrators will share the victim information in order to target that victim for another fraud in the future. What that looks like is that the cycle of victimization is higher in financial frauds because there's this devious plan that stretches the fraud out through claims that, there's a new opportunity to recoup your losses, or, we're the agency that said we couldn't help you, but now we've opened your file and actually you should send us more information. You should send us more personal details and access because now we can help you. And all of these things are fraudulent claims. Like the perpetrators are just trying to recycle old information from the last crime to perpetrate a new one. And so in financial frauds, that re-victimization, repeat victimization is very high. Okay, at this point, we've sort of reviewed the problem of financial abuse and fraud, and you can kind of see really the complexities that go into these issues. The next section on supported decision making in context, I'm going to explore some considerations of culture and some of the social norms involved in this, and look more closely at the example of enduring powers of attorney in financial abuse and fraud. So to sort of set up what I mean and what's referred to when we're talking about supported decision making. So substitute decision making laws are in many parts of the country and in many countries around the world. And basically, an individual assumes responsibility to make decisions for another because they've been deemed incapable, right? And that incapable is related to making decisions. Whereas supported decision making is based on a foundation of dignity. Supporters may be appointed or named through informal or formal arrangements. And those support arrangements may include permission to advocate for the older adult, or to assist with communication, or deal with certain property or assets of the individual. And supported decision making takes that holistic view of the individual's choices. So if the support arrangement is solely to do with property and finances, it's likely going to be called an enduring power of attorney. And it'll be some version of that naming across the country, across Canada. And it can be structured around supported decision-making principles. So knowing that the risk of being victimized is higher for women, it's higher for seniors who've experienced mistreatment earlier in their lives. It's higher for people of color. It's also higher amongst people who live with someone that's financially dependent on them. So introducing a principled approach to supported decision-making, supporting the inclusion of accommodations, taking into account the lived experience of that older adult is really important when setting up a decision-making type of arrangement. And so the older adults, just by aging, you don't lose your legal capacity. You shouldn't lose your autonomy or your self-determination because you've aged. And the positive here is that in a more supported decision-making environment, you can build a network of people, a larger trust circle that you'll be able to call upon. And so the positive side of pre-planning is really building that network, using the legislation we have to the older adult's advantage. So for example, if an enduring power of attorney builds protective clauses and checks and balances, then the allegations of abuse or misuse of that document will be more easily made by the people in that group that are supporting you. So it can lessen the burden on the older adult, the person who's made the power of attorney, who may at that stage have lost their decision-making ability, right? But supporters can see what's happening on the face of the document is maybe not what should be, or what's supposed to be being done is not specifically empowered to be done. So we'll take sort of that enduring power of attorney forward. Next slide. That's as a sort of case study. So when we're talking about criminal and civil liability and the impact on victims of financial fraud and abuse, because there's so many examples. I just want to hone in on one in particular to use in order to highlight how all these overlapping structures work when it comes to supports for victims. Next slide. Thank you. So with enduring powers of attorney, the criminal code is pretty rarely used across the country for misuse and abuse of a power of attorney, but there is a defined criminal offense regarding the unlawful conduct involving a power of attorney. Civil law, provincial and territorial superior court cases are relatively common if the maker has financial means to support the costs, right? So if the maker has a modest estate or really low income, it's very unlikely that civil remedies will be sought, even if they have merit, even if there's no doubt something has occurred and some kind of compensation should be returned to the person. Civil processes are expensive. And so it's a question of costs and the burden being on that plaintiff, that applicant, alleging that wrongful conduct to carry that case forward. Looking at two provisions in the criminal code, it's a crime under section 331 for anyone acting under the authority of a power of attorney to take advantage of their power to dispose or convert of the property of the maker for a purpose other than that for which the person was entrusted by the power of attorney. So basically, they were able to put within this provision the power of attorney structure because it is such a powerful document. Further, for sentencing, the vulnerability of the victim may be considered an aggravating factor. And so we see this applied to situations involving fraud and abuse where maybe a section 331 has been laid, and then we're talking about sentencing because there's been a conviction or a guilty plea. So these reported cases listed here are some of the several we have involving the abuse and misuse of an enduring power of attorney. There's not a lot of them, but employing section 718.2 is something we'll see in all those cases. In Earhart, I mentioned earlier in the discussion, it's a common law partner. They were convicted of theft by a person holding a power of attorney under section 331. The justice applied 718.2 to evidence that Earhart abused his position of trust in relationship to the victim. In describing the evidence presented, the justice found coercive, controlling conduct by Earhart, with him taking advantage of the vulnerabilities of Ms. Driscoll. So the justice considered the victim's age and health when sentencing the accused, and on the section 331, Earhart was sentenced to a year in prison, and then there was an $82,000 restitution order payable to the late Ms. Driscoll's estate. Turning from criminal liability, right? So we know it exists for financial fraud and abuse in relation to something like a power of attorney, but it's used fairly sparingly. Civil law is more common. So under civil liability and remedies, enduring powers of attorney are covered by different legislation in every province and territory across the country. So there are, however, some unifying aspects amongst the legislative requirements, like some kind of record keeping or accounting. And so in Nova Scotia, there were updates to the Powers of Attorney Act over the last few years, which included statutory fiduciary duties. There were some other sections increasing transparency for the attorney's actions. And we had a case pretty soon after the first round of legislative changes came into effect called Galbraith v. Smith. And Justice Norton kind of outlined in the first couple of paragraphs, I'd just like to read here this scenario. So many adult Nova Scotians are called upon to manage the affairs of their aging parents when they are no longer able to do so for themselves due to deterioration of physical or mental health. Often this is done by one or more of the adult children being given a power of attorney. The powers given to the attorney are not unfettered. The attorney is in a fiduciary relationship with the donor and must act in good faith and in the best interests of the donor. To this end, there are both common law and statutory obligations that the attorney must adhere to. The attorney is responsible to account for the decisions made during any period of incapacity of the donor. An attorney may be found liable for breach of their duty and may be ordered to reimburse the donor. So ultimately, in that Smith case, the accused was ordered to pay a minimum of $80,000 back to the estate of this deceased mother. So in both of those cases, and they're not unique in that where I've discussed here, the victim did not survive to verdict. And unfortunately, the length and complication of these types of cases of financial fraud and abuse makes that a real possibility. Next slide. So in considering the impact on victims, knowing that the victim, they may not survive to verdict, or they may not understand the verdict when it's reached, that the length of time it takes to move a case through the system, whether it's criminal or civil, it's really a fraught process. And so the 4 factors discussed, making older adults vulnerable to financial fraud and abuse, the physiological, psychological, familial, sociocultural vulnerabilities. We see them in the cases that make it to court and show the serious impact on older adults and their well-being. And when we examine liability in these cases, we see how these vulnerabilities are factored into the decisions delivered by the justices. So in reconciling, how best to help older adults in these cases, I think it's clear that keeping vulnerabilities front of mind is important while not falling into the practice of grouping older adults into, one group, one homogeneous group. It is really important. So in these 2 examples, seniors more likely being on fixed incomes. So financially, they're more personally devastated after a financial fraud or abuse situation, or seniors not being accommodated, right? So instead of being able to give a witness statement or being provided accommodations to do so, they're assessed as unreliable witnesses due to some kind of cognitive decline, and the matter won't go forward. And like in all of these examples, there's obvious harm to their well-being. And that harm can be hard to mitigate. So at least 80% of victims of crime suffer, emotional impacts, right? Shock and anger. And we also see in financial abuse cases the shame, embarrassment, security loss, and a real high vulnerability to repeated scams. Thinking positively, the positive I see is when victims receive appropriate supports after a financial crime, this can mitigate the harm caused by the crime itself. And as supporters, we can reduce the chance of re-victimization. We can, kind of understand, because mitigation is difficult, and in older financial fraud and abuse cases affecting older adults, the risk of re-victimization is so high. It's really on us as supporters to provide the appropriate supports to these victims, understanding their histories and where they're coming from to the best of our abilities. And next slide, the best sort of approach, which will be very familiar to many people today, that I know that has worked and works in financial fraud and abuse cases, is making sure the supporter is taking a trauma-informed, victim-centered approach. So acknowledging the victim's experience, reassuring them they're not to blame, right? There is a lot of guilt and desperation in financial matters related to the fraud and abuse that an older adult encounters. And, that is a big component in being a part of listening and letting the victim share their story interrupted, connecting those two. It's also important to advise them that they can reach out as often as needed. Frauds are often ongoing, and it's not like there's a roadmap, like this is going to happen to you because that happened. It's really sort of an up and down sort of process and ongoing. And so victims need to know that they can continue to reach out multiple times. A lot of services have really strict service limits, and that is really difficult in financial crimes, because the information will be shared in 1 month, and then maybe 14 or 15 months they'll reach out to again in order to try and defraud or try to abuse the person financially in some other type of way. So letting them know that they can keep coming back. And then introducing the utility of a safety plan. So taking advantage of safety planning is not something that was seen a lot of, but is starting to gain some popularity, because especially in an abuse situation where the caregiver or family member is the perpetrator, having a safety plan in place, because you may be living in the same residence as, say, an older adult, then where will they go, or what will happen if the perpetrator, who is their adult child, is also living in the home with them? What is the plan if they are going to be raising these issues? How they're going to best prepare themselves to deal with all the associated complications that's another sort of aspect of safety planning that can be really important as a part of making sure we as supporters are kind of giving the best options available to the person we're trying to support. And yeah, so this is the final section of my talk today. So kind of understanding where we've traveled through till this point. I'm going to turn to promising practices really from sort of a Nova Scotia perspective. And again, I'd love to learn what you're doing in your communities. If you can add that into the chat, send out any sort of comments or contributions, it'd be great to hear. It's wonderful to have access to this national resource and broad platform, and it's just so important to know what's happening on the ground in your areas and where those local solutions are working or what you're learning from is so helpful. So please feel free to drop those in. And carrying on from trauma-informed care and training, promising practice. So trauma-informed care, it's been a core tenet of our services at the Legal Information Society of Nova Scotia. We offer a few core services, including a toll-free phone line for people. Because of this direct service, we hear from individuals, sharing these personal stories, or family and friends, or professional support, social workers who are reaching out, saying an older adult is being financially abused or scammed. Where can they go? What can they do? And as a part of, Legal Info Line best practices, these principles of trauma-informed care to, listen and validate a victim's experience, provide clear information, and also expectations about services that our nonprofit charity provides are, all built into our delivery expectations. So this trauma-informed approach is something we recommend to supporters, to the people who call in, to the people who we meet out in the community, because we have a free online webinar people can access. So we have a trauma-informed care training presented by restorative practitioner Sheila LeBlanc in partnership with LISNS. Price isn't a barrier, it's free to the public, and I like to recommend it to anyone assisting others, even as a refresher for people volunteering in the community, to community groups. Once people complete the session, they receive a completion certificate. It's just a really helpful resource for people to check out. Another promising practice has to do with powers of attorney. So in light of the changes to the Nova Scotia Powers of Attorney Act, we developed some resources for people really addressing the concerns we were hearing about on the ground. So as I mentioned earlier in the talk, enduring powers of attorney, they're very common in estate planning, but they're different in every province and territory. Regardless, in all jurisdictions, the person making the power of attorney, the older adult, usually appoints an agent, the attorney, the person who's going to do the work, to be able to act on their behalf. And it's called an enduring power of attorney because it includes clauses that allow the document to keep working, even if the person loses their decision-making ability. So it's very helpful for, keeping bills paid and services running. But it does involve a lot of trust. And what we saw in those earlier cases, attorneys may abuse and misuse the maker's trust, but the vast majority of attorneys appointed in enduring powers of attorney are close family and friends, right? And they're mostly trying to do their best. And so we've developed really a how-to guide. So we focused on areas that involve the biggest changes to the legislation, like record keeping and accounting and notice requirements. This image is taken from our website, so you can see there are links people can click and download and print forms for attorneys to use when they're fulfilling those duties. And we were able to receive some grant funding to have the forms in English translated to French for greater accessibility. So there's some formularies there. The content is also really valuable for the person making the power of attorney. So what are examples of what the person I'm asking to do this job would look like, right? am I allowed to ask these questions? Feeling empowered, knowing that just because you've appointed someone in a power of attorney doesn't mean you've given away your power. And so one of the key ways to target being that financial abuse sort of scenario that we see is by having the maker, while they're able, with their supporters, and there's lots of different ways supporters can show up in this environment, that they are entitled to information, that it is still, the maker's property and their autonomy, and their self-determination is just as intact as it has been before. And so in testing these forms and development of these forms, we had a lot of people also asking for digital options. So we've got some, Excel spreadsheets for people to tinker with. And again, the mission here is just in addressing fraud and abuse, how can we make it as transparent as possible, the work of an attorney? An attorney is just the person who's in charge in that document, the person who's been appointed, that agent, to help really facilitate that shift away from, substitution, I'm just going to say what you need, to a more supported decision-making approach. This is what I would expect. This is what I want more info on. This is how I'd like to kind of move forward in these areas. And a part of that approach and delivery of services is really what we did in community outreach. So many others may find this as well. Accessible meeting spaces, reducing isolation by meeting in person. We incorporated nutrition breaks into our sessions and just opened up a world of sharing and trust building, because people would come out, whether they'd had a meal that day or whether they had, older adults in particular have, a lot of issues related to food security. And even that, just having people come out and sharing through the nutrition break, information and stories and questions, really relaxed people and, literally brought them to the table and really increased the connections and the networking in the various communities as well that we were going to. So when we put these education sessions on, we're collaborating around the province with the seniors groups that are there, with other service providers, and it has really increased the awareness about financial abuse and fraud. When we look at, our web traffic, when we look at the requests we receive for more talks across the province, we see that there's just a high appetite for all of that. Another initiative we had begun to kind of address, again, more broadly, what financial fraud and abuse was through investor rights and protection series. So, there's a guide that provides education on investors' rights and protections with first-person stories via a video. So, one first-person perspective is from an older adult explaining his approach to investing and tips on when to ask for help. And again, just kind of broadening the discussion of what financial fraud and abuse can look like in an older adult's life, right? Whether it's some sort of subtle manipulation by a family member or outright pressure tactics from a scammer. It's really all kinds of different forms that we're trying to address. And at the end of the day, the support can look pretty much the same. So that's another example. And another example in Nova Scotia is the Partners Against Fraud Network. So it's basically an information sharing network. Campaigned, recognize it, report it, stop it by the Department of Seniors and Long-Term Care in Nova Scotia, really focusing on increasing awareness and tactics and encouraging the public to report to the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre and really work together locally to identify frauds more quickly and issues of abuse more quickly. And next slide. The Nova Scotia Securities Commission, another promising practice, I think, in the area, who is also is a member of this Partners Against Fraud, like I was mentioning, network, basically deals with all the warnings about scams and investments. And their team developed novacrypto.ca in response to like a rapid rise in victims of investment frauds. So Nova Crypto, it basically mimics a fraudulent crypto trading website that, is stealing millions of dollars from investors each year. We get calls on the line, people who have invested, $25,000, $45,000. They are so confident that there has to be a way to get this money back. They are so devastated by the fact that they were taken in by something that looked like it was coming from a friend or a family member, a link, something that connected them through to a scam that then gained access to their accounts. It's just so rapid and so serious. Of the 700 million reported last year alone, about 350 million is in these investment sort of scams. So the Nova Crypto website, it basically warns investors once they're sort of baited and click on a link somewhere in their online travels. They get this warning that they are on a fraudulent crypto trading website before they invest and, really suffer that irreversible loss. Next slide kind of shows you, this is what, so people would see, they would think that, they've clicked on one thing and it sent them to this location and they think, oh, okay, this is a great thing for me to invest because everything's more expensive and everyone talks about how, how worthwhile and innovative and all these different things that this type of product is supposed to be. And what they actually find when they go to click further into the website, you go to the next slide, is a warning. So they are basically then confronted with an image saying, you have been led to a fake website, a fake trading website. And there's some information on red flags and that sort of thing, because it is really that quick, right? It's a really innovative way to show how the social media environment can basically connect you before you know it to these financial scams. And they're operated, without oversight and really take advantage of all these vulnerabilities. And we are seeing a lot of older adults with maybe not these millions, with smaller amounts, who are just as valuable or important to them. It may be, their entire sort of nest egg and it's now gone. So that's a really innovative way to kind of use that environment to showcase for people what it actually is, right? Model that whole process in real time. And we kind of we've reached the summary, kind of reached the end of the chat. So what I'd like to sort of leave with is that we all know the abuse of older adults is increasing. Financial abuse, family violence against older adults has greatly increased since 2018. And we know the population is aging. We know that there's, more people that fall in these categories that are basically being deliberately targeted or are in situations where, because of their family relationship, they are at greater risk because of the stresses and the other financial problems their family members are facing, and they're kind of in that direct line of control and dependency. And so combating financial fraud and abuse really requires a multidisciplinary approach. We need to make sure we're approaching it from a trauma-informed, victim-centered practice. We need to think of innovative solutions, right, to address how rapidly all this is changing, and really understanding that the non-judgmental support of victims, it needs to be available and funded and ongoing, because it is such a huge problem that impacts so many older adults and their families and friends and the structures that we're all kind of operating in, the hospitals, the care centers, the community groups, across the board. It's impacting in so many ways anyone who comes into contact with an older adult who's faced this. We just had another story of power of attorney use, where unfortunately all of the funds were drained by the attorney of the individual. And that individual is now being supported by the community through a couple of charities to have housing. And it's really a question of making sure we're all kind of approaching it together and sharing as much information as possible, again, in that environment. The last couple of slides are just reference slides for, I believe they're available for people to access, just references of organizations and articles I've cited here throughout today. And yeah, thank you. And also, whether or not there's any contributions on chat, I mean, that would be wonderful. Any initiatives in your area, and if you have anything you'd like to speak about earlier, feel free to reach out. Legalinfo.org, Dianna@legalinfo.org. Just so interested in being as transparent and open to discussion